Greetings and welcome. My name is Jeremy Stern with Google Fiber. And on August 24th, 2015, the Google Doodle for the day honored the 125th birthday of the great Duke Kahanamoku, a 5-time Olympic medalist in swimming and the father of modern surfing. No American athlete has influenced two sports as profoundly as Kahanamoku did, and yet he remains an enigmatic and underappreciated figure. Our guest today will share his deep insights and expertise on the life and times of Duke Kahanamoku, a true waterman. I'm delighted to introduce to Google noted author and writer David Davis. David, an Angelino, has published several books, and his works have been published and appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Sports Illustrated, and many other illustrious publications. A couple administrative matters. Of course, we're taping this for Talks at Google, a site on YouTube, and there will be time for questions at the end. And because we're taping, please make sure that you use the microphone to ask your questions so that we capture your questions for the video audience. David, welcome to Google Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for having me. Enjoy your lunch while we talk a little bit about Duke. And just to preface this, partly why I embarked on this project starting in 2011 is there really hadn't been, that I had seen, a comprehensive biography of Duke Kahanamoku. And it was one of those sort of mysteries as why hasn't there been, because of his enormous impact and legacy. So the interesting thing was the more research I did, the more sort of I uncovered that he was sort of bigger than life, maybe even than I imagined. So what I'd like to do today with you is, in a sense, give you a little overview of his life. And what's sort of interesting is that his life, beyond just the sports angle, which is, of course, an important part of the book and the research, but his life really parallels modern Hawaii, and really starting from his birth, from his roots, and he is full-blooded Hawaiian. This is his father, Duke Kahanamoku Sr., who was, as you can see, a part of the Honolulu Police Department at that time. And interesting note, one of his colleagues at the time was the real-life model for Charlie Chan, the detective, who, of course, was made into several films. But he was a sergeant. Duke Kahanamoku, everybody at the time, 1890, when Duke is born, Hawaii's a monarchy. It's an independent nation run by Queen Liliuokalani. And there was sort of a mystery about Duke's first name. A lot of people thought, oh, he's got to be royalty or related. And actually, Hawaii royal bloodlines are quite complicated. He wasn't a direct lineage, but his name really just came from his father, which was Duke. And this is his mother, Julia, and it's really her family, the Paoa family, P-A-O-A, that, in a sense, Duke takes his waterman roots from. The Paoa family were quite influential and as waterman, and I use that term specifically in Hawaii and Honolulu, Waikiki. Waterman is really an honorific title. It's a very important part of the culture. Of course, Hawaii being such a isolated island chain, and especially wasn't even sort of discovered, quote unquote, until very late in the game. And so to be a waterman was I mean, that means you know how to paddle, you know how to sail, you know where the fishing holes are, you know the tides, the wind. It's a very important aspect. And Duke, in a sense, takes his roots, his waterman roots, from the Paoa family. And the other thing that they took, in a sense, was his mother's family. They had a plot of land in Waikiki. And when 1893, when, in a sense, Hawaii's monarchy gets toppled, of course, America having a huge influence and stake in this, the family retreats to Waikiki. And in a sense, Duke is raised in Waikiki and spends much of his formative years in Waikiki, which people know today, all the tourists, hotels, etc. But back then, my gosh, it was so isolated, and it was freshwater streams coming down from the mountains. There were taro patches, rice paddies, that sort of thing. It was this sort of idyllic water festival of life. And if you were born and raised there, you just ran into the ocean. That was part of your upbringing, part of what you did. This is really the first example we have of Duke in playing sports. He went to the Kamehameha schools, which at the time, frankly, they're very prestigious in this day and age, but at the time were really trade schools for native Hawaiians. And it was part of the effort to inculcate religion and speak English language only, that sort of thing. And if I can make this work, you can see Duke, of course, in the back. I'm not sure I can make this work. On the soccer team. Let me see, can I make that? Yeah. And this is the Kamehameha schools. And he was quite a good soccer player, but his forte, his efforts would really come via the water. And this is an early shot of Duke and his surfboard. And as you can see, these are enormous planks of wood. And for those of you who know surfing history, surf historians, back then the surfboards were basically 125 pound planks of wood, koa or redwood, 12 foot, 16 feet long. It was a very different style of surfing than today, which are the foam boards and shorter and very maneuverable with fins and that sort of thing. These are just, one commentator called them coffin lids as a description. And that's basically what they were. But I will point out, and you'll see some photos of Duke a little bit later without sort of his top. It seems to me that this is, in a sense, the first instance, or one of the first instances of cross-training, because he had to lug that board through the sand. I mean, if you're going to go surfing, you have to lug a 120-pound board, through the sand, get out there, paddle out. The thing gets soaked. You got to bring that back in, and you're walking around, and that's a workout. And you'll see he's really got a modern body. I mean, this was probably taken about 1912, 1915. And this is what it looks like. I mean, it was pretty much you paddled out and you came straight in. And this is shot in Waikiki, probably near Diamond Head area. And we know today about the North Shore. Everybody, those are the big surf contests in Hawaii and Oahu. And those are generally coming up, actually, December, Christmas time. Nobody could surf the North Shore back then. It just wasn't possible with the equipment, with the boards. You basically just went straight. And Duke comes around, so we're talking 1900 when he's 10. America makes Hawaii a colony of sorts, however you want to look at it. It was part of the imperialistic sort of surge of America in the late 1890s, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, sort of America going beyond its the mainland boundaries, and very specifically strategic, military, looking to Asia, Pacific Rim, and Britain. So that makes Duke a American citizen, which of course changes the direction of his life. And one of that direction is about sports and organized sports. And America having something called the AAU, which was a way to organize amateur sports back then. That was something that Duke could participate in. And just before I leave this slide and move on to his swimming career, it's interesting to note that Duke, we call him the father of surfing, and one of the reasons we say that is he and some other mates on Waikiki formed basically the first surf club, which was called the Hui Nalu. And they were, in a sense, orphans because the main athletic club at the time was the Outrigger Canoe Club. And the Outrigger Canoe Club was whites only. And so Duke and his mates formed their own sort of more informal club called the Hui Nalu, and that became the basis of his, and they in a sense devised some of the rules that we still deal with in terms of surfing. And the Hui Nalu became sort of an area that Duke could sort of springboard with when it came to swimming. Because while in Hawaii he maybe had been known for his surfing skills, and basically at that time the only surfing that was done was in Hawaii, to get beyond that, he turned to competitive swimming. This photo is a historic photo. Again, one of those moments when Duke's life changes forever. This is 1911 in August. First AAU meet ever in Hawaii, and it's a swim meet. And Duke is out in front by quite a bit. He sets 2 world's records that day in the 50 and the 100. And as you can see, it's Honolulu, it's outdoors. That's what most of the swimming events were back then. It was outdoors. There were very few pools. There wasn't sort of the modern guidelines that we have today with its 50 meters and precisely measured. This is sort of sports just beginning to get organized. And Duke does indeed set the records in the 50 and the 100. What's interesting is that when the Hawaiian officials quite proudly send the marks into New York, the home office of the AAU, the records are rejected. And they give all sorts of weak and lame excuses for why the records were turned down. But basically it was sort of, it's Hawaii. It's so far away. They have no oversight. They have no knowledge of Hawaii and what these athletes can do. So they reject Duke's records. And it's interesting to note that while that was obviously a setback and Duke was upset about it, what it did was it rallied the Hawaiian sort of community around Duke, because they were in a sense as well insulted by that. And they decided to prove that Duke could actually swim that fast, could beat the best on the mainland. And he came from a working class family. By this time, he had dropped out of high school. He was making a living sort of as a beach boy, what we would call a beach boy today, taking tourists out, teaching them how to swim and maybe surf lessons or in the outrigger canoe. And Hawaii rallied around Duke and paid for him to come to the mainland in 1912 to try to qualify for the US Olympic team that was going to Sweden, to Stockholm, to compete at the 1912 Olympics. So here's Duke, his first presence on the mainland. And as you can see, those are the competitive swimsuits of the day. They were heavy, heavy cotton or if they were lucky, they were silk, but they were heavy cotton. Men had to sort of wear almost like a codpiece type thing. And if you think that's restrictive, you should have seen what the women had to wear. But they were a very, very elaborate contest. This is sort of the end of the Victorian prudish era. But Duke was an anomaly at this time in 1912. A few people had ever been to Hawaii. Few people could ever find it on a map, quite frankly. And here he is, a dark-skinned Pacific Islander coming to represent the United States at the Olympics. And that was a little bit different. Maybe there were some Native Americans, most prominently Jim Thorpe on the team, but it was pretty much a white-only team in the Olympics at that time for America. And here's Duke this is the entire US swim team, Olympic swim team for 1912. And if you think about Duke's journey, he had to take a steamship from Honolulu to the mainland, take railroads across the country, and then take another ship from New York to Stockholm to compete. And at that time, just as a side note, you can see there's 7 men, and the head of the amateur AAU was James Sullivan. He was not a big proponent of women in sports, and so this was the first Olympics that women swimmers were competing, but James Sullivan refused to allow the Americans to field a women's team, so it was just the men. And Duke, quite frankly, is great. And you see him here in the middle. This is all outdoors, so it's quite frigid conditions in Stockholm. Though apparently the weather was actually quite nice, so they got lucky. But Duke smashed records. He won the 100 in controversial fashion. So there were a lot of headlines about, was he going to make the finals? Did he make the finals? Will he win the gold medal? Well, he did. And then they took the silver medal in the relay. And just to point out, there were just very, very few swimming events back then. So we talk about Michael Phelps winning, 8 Olympic medals in the last Olympics. Well, I don't even think there were 8 swimming events for the men, just by themselves. There was no butterfly, there was no individual medley, there was maybe 1 relay, that sort of thing. So we're talking the opportunity was not very vast for him as a swimmer, but he made the most of it. And here he is accepting his medal from the king, King Gustav. And like Jim Thorpe, he returned, Duke Kahanamoku returns to America a star, a celebrity. Here he is, marching, parading in New York City with the Olympic team. And he's holding, by the way, that's a camera that he's holding in his left hand. That's those sort of big clunky cameras back then. He's now famous. Anywhere he goes for appearances, for meets, it's headline. They want to interview him. And this says, Kanaka swimmer has no equal in the water. Kanaka refers, in a sense, to Hawaiian native. It's a little controversial term in and of itself, but that was, there weren't anybody like Duke. And so press and media felt okay to just call him what they wanted to, and they would make up interviews and just publish it, frankly. But he's a celebrity, and people demand his services to swim. They want to see him. This is his trip to Australia, 1914, 1950, 15. You see that little speck in the water, black, dark speck? That's Duke surfing. And the people on shore are just amazed. They think this is a guy walking on water. There had maybe been, not even a handful of surfers in Australia. This is sort of the first celebrity, and so when he would come, newspapers would write about him. He didn't come with a board, by the way, when he went to Australia. He went to swim, and then he decided, he saw the waves, said, hey, I'm gonna surf. He went to a lumber yard and shaped a board and carved it out. And it was, I think, some pine wood in Australia. And then he would leave it behind. And in a sense, he was sort of the Johnny Appleseed of surfing. He would leave a board, that would become sort of the model. And people would, oh yeah, let's do that shape. And he was very happy to leave that alone. And you can see, here he is in the middle. This is the crowds that he would draw. This is he went there in the winter, of course, Australia being, our winter, Australia's summer. And so everybody just mobbed to come out to see him. And he toured, he would compete in San Francisco at the Sutro Baths. He would come down here to Southern California. He started surfing in Corona del Mar, Long Beach, the South Bay. Those were the big surf areas back then. And Corona del Mar being the jewel, and we'll see a little bit more of that later. But he's starting to establish sort of an international reputation, and he's starting to make friends in Southern California, Los Angeles, especially people at the Los Angeles Athletic Club. And again, that will sort of play out later in his life. One of his trips to Southern California, he was in Hollywood. He was put in a movie. And you can see the gentleman on Duke's left was Hobart Bosworth, a famous producer, director at the time, a buddy of Jack London, and he brought Duke in and made a little two-reeler. These are all silent movies, of course. And just to point out, you can see, Duke's body, that's a modern day body. And most of his opponents, quite frankly, did not have that. This is, again, from, he wasn't natural, he trained. He was a competitor. And by the way, that movie is lost, unfortunately, like a lot of the silent movies of today. When he would go to the mainland, and this was shot in Chicago, he often was backed by the Hawaii promotion outfit, and Duke would be, hey, play a ditty, play a song. He would do that. It would help promote Hawaii, which the business interests were very, very keen on. And in a sense, Duke was, through his sports, through surfing and through swimming, he was helping to promote Hawaii. And again, this will be part of a theme in his life, that he becomes so connected to his homeland, to Hawaii. And he was, of course, very proud of that. I should point out, in 1916, again, when we talk about, he won 5 Olympic medals, that's a lot, but Michael Phelps did that in 1 Olympics. But the Olympics of 1916 were canceled, of course, for World War I. They were supposed to be in Berlin. And so Duke, in the prime of his athletic life, was not able to defend his crown in 1916. So, but he decides to stay on and stay an amateur, and that's no easy feat back then, because there weren't endorsements. You weren't allowed to take an endorsement if you were an amateur athlete. So Duke did make it to the 1920 Olympics, and this is him on the far, I guess it would be on the far right, and with his teammates, many of whom were Hawaiian. And Duke, again, just not shocks the world. By then, he's the defending champ, but he's also 30 years old, which is quite ancient for swimmers, even today. And Duke defends his title in the 100 and wins the relay as well, sort of adding to his fame. And having skipped 1916 Olympics from 1912 to 1920, it's a pretty incredible feat. And here you can see this is the relay team. The Olympics of 1920 were in Antwerp. It was sort of a last-minute thing. Pierre de Coubertin, the head of the IOC at the time, wanted to get the Olympics get back going after World War I, and so the Olympics were in Antwerp. And frankly, they weren't. They were a war-torn country at that time and weren't really prepared. And the conditions were just abysmal, and including the pool, absolutely frigid temperatures, and you can see them. The guys just sort of huddling to stay warm. And as I said, Duke's relay team wins the gold, so he adds 2 gold medals. I do point out that the competition wasn't that great in 1920 because of the damage of the war, unfortunately. Germany was not allowed to compete. Russia was not allowed to compete in 1920. And frankly, a lot of the competitors from Australia, the young men from Australia, many had died or been wounded in the war. So the competition level was a little less in 1920, but Duke was there, and he trained and won the gold. And this, just so you can see what the start line looks like in 1920, outdoors, masses of people around. After the Olympics, Duke returns briefly to Hawaii, but he comes to Southern California for the first time for an extended stay in 1922. And he's brought here by a promoter specifically to be, a Hollywood star. And these are one of the promotion pictures. I believe this is Venice Beach. And Duke, of course, shooting a few golf balls while his promoter, handler, has the surfboard in the background. And the initial plans fell through, and Duke was not a star. And as you'll see, and I'll get to this a little bit later, he did run across, of course, Hollywood, the racism of Hollywood at the time, and certainly, no leading man could be, a non-white to get the girl and so on. So Duke has a good time, though. He surfs in Southern California. He, as you can see, up and down, that's, I think, Corona del Mar, Venice. That was on the cover of the Los Angeles Times Sunday magazine. And again, a little bit risque in the sense of you have a dark-skinned man and a white, the woman is actually the wife of his coach. And Duke joins the Los Angeles Athletic Club. And you can see their logo. That's one of the Olympic swimmers. By now, James Sullivan has died, so women can now compete for America in the Olympics, and they do quite well in diving and in swimming. That's Mickey Riley, another great diver, and Duke's wearing a beard there. He gets basically to be an extra in the films, and I'll show you some other slides of that. But that logo on his waist or around his thigh there, that's still the logo, the Mercury logo of the Los Angeles Athletic Club. And that became sort of the basis of his life, both in terms of athletics and swimming, competition, but also social life and so forth. A lot of Hollywood stars were part of the Los Angeles Athletic Club. And he stays in training because the Hollywood thing didn't really pan out in 1922, 23. He decides to go for the Olympics in 1924, which were in Paris. This is a sort of a beautiful outdoor stadium. It was the first pool that was 50 meters for the Olympics, I believe, or at least built that way. But now Duke is 34 years old, again, now beyond ancient for swimming, and especially sprints. And so there's some major competition, including his younger brother. Duke had about 6, 7 siblings. This is Sam Kahanamoku, smaller, but had emerged in the early 20s as the top sprinter in Hawaii. So Duke is competing against his younger brother. And he's also competing against a guy who would become his arch rival in this time span. And this is, of course, Johnny Weissmuller. Okay, and the logo it's Illinois Athletic Club. They were out of Chicago, and that was a hotbed of competitive swimming. And Johnny was, in some ways, very similar to Duke. He was working class stock. He was a high school dropout. In some ways, they were very similar. And he was also an amazing swimmer. And he is 21, 22 years old here. Duke is 34. And they don't meet. The newspapers sort of build up this rivalry. They don't meet until the Olympic trials of 1924. And then they meet again in the Olympics. And spoiler alert, we'll tell you what happens on that. And just so here is the Olympic team for 1924 for the United States. As you can see, this is the Hawaiian contingent. As you can see, there's now women on the team, and Duke and his younger brother. And this is the finals, and Duke and Johnny head to head, and Johnny is on the right there in the middle of the frame of the photo, and Johnny wins the gold medal. Duke takes silver, but this is now the 20s. We're talking the roaring 20s, and whereas Duke was a big star, a major star, Johnny turns out to be a mega star. I mean, you've got the 20s of Babe Ruth, you've got Jack Dempsey, you've got sports stars becoming bigger than life. And in a sense, Johnny takes advantage of that, as we'll see. And Duke was friends with Johnny. They were rivals, of course, but was friends even afterwards, and as we'll see as well later. But obviously it was a disappointment. This was going to be perhaps his swan song for Duke at the Olympics, and only gets second, and his younger brother Sam got the bronze medal. So Duke retreated to Hollywood, or Southern California, and he did pursue a career. He signed with Paramount, and here he is in Lord Jim, and he's helping to teach one of the actresses how to swim. Here he is in the Pony Express, playing a Native American Indian, of course. He was actually a good horseback rider. This is Hula, which is one of the few that were actually having a Hawaiian theme in it. And the actress that he's playing with is Clara Bow, who was known as the It Girl, was the big star of Hollywood back in the 20s, early 20s. But I think you can sort of see a theme emerging, which is to say Duke was not a star. He was an extra, and he was playing sort of these character roles that, what we would call ethnic roles, and that was unfortunately the extent of his. And he appeared in, a couple dozen movies, but never got really the big star. And most of these were silent. Some of these are lost to today. We don't have access to them. But some of the, like Hula, we have a full version of, it's a pretty amazing little movie, actually. Here he is playing a Barbary a pirate, okay, getting strangled by Wallace Beery. And there's sort of the glamour shot. And as you can tell, he's sort of playing a tribesman of sorts. And unfortunately, that was about as far as he could go in Hollywood. And so this is probably about 1925, 26, 27, around that time. He still keeps surfing. He teaches some of the Hollywood community how to surf. He's one of the first surfers to surf in Malibu, and starts extending surfing as surfing becomes sort of beyond Hawaii and coming to Southern California. And this was probably taken in Corona del Mar, down in Orange County, which was the primo surf spot, as I mentioned. And you can see that board is just, 12 feet, 16 feet. And he would retreat here with buddies from the Los Angeles Athletic Club. And it was at Corona del Mar in 1925 that Duke made national headlines again. And when I was researching this book, I kept running across references of Duke rescuing people swimming. And this was in Hawaii, this was on the mainland, and it was sort of part and parcel of being a waterman. You would notice people who didn't swim very well, and quite frankly, in those days, they didn't have a lot of swimming instruction and fins to learn on as a kid. So there were quite many accidents back in that day of drowning and so forth. So I kept running across this, rescuing people, would-be drowning victims. And it all came to fruition in 1925 in Corona del Mar. And these are his buddies, a couple buddies from the Los Angeles Athletic Club. And what happened that day, it was a fishing vessel, a recreational fishing vessel went out with a bunch of guys from Riverside, California. They were going to fish for abalone, and they were trying to get out of the harbor, and they got smashed by a groundswell. And a couple just rogue waves just slammed into the boat, the Thelma, and it capsized and overturned. And Duke, as you can see with this surfboard, saw what was happening. They were just down to surf. He ran out into the surf, paddled out, threw 3 guys, drowning victims, on his surfboard, paddled in, deposited them on the beach to his buddies, went out again, got 3 more, paddled in, did it one more time. And he was credited later, overall, with rescuing 8 people. And never got really thank you'd for it by the people at that time, though he got some medals from the Los Angeles Athletic Club. But it was one of those episodes, again, he sort of made national headlines, but it was also important because people realized the importance of a surfboard. It wasn't just about recreation. It was a life-saving device, perhaps. It was something beyond just, okay, we're gonna have fun in the waves. So it established that sort of tradition. By now, Duke is, late 30s, Hollywood career not working out so well. He retreats to Hawaii for a while and tries to figure out what's next. He had never really taken a job. He got some sort of crappy jobs. He was like a janitor. People were sort of horrified to discover he's mowing the lawn of City Hall in Honolulu. And he's just trying to figure out what is next. And frankly, Los Angeles called. And 1932 is Los Angeles Olympics. And the Olympics Games of 32 in LA were pretty much spearheaded by the Los Angeles Athletic Club. So they basically called Duke and said, hey, do you want to give it one more time? And he's now basically 40 years old. But he loves LA, Olympic Games of 32. It's the first time since the Games of 1904 that the Olympics are in what they would call the New World. And the 1904 Games were sort of, nobody even noticed them. So this was a big deal. So he said, I'm going to try for it, see what happens. And as you can see, the Games, this was the building they built the Coliseum in the 20s to bid for the Games, in a sense. And obviously you can, the reference today, of course, LA looking for the 2024 bid, but they certainly had the wherewithal to build it. And Curtis, by the way, that headline is the vice president. Herbert Hoover decided not to show up for the opening ceremonies. This is during, of course, the Depression. And here's Duke. He's on the far left there with Johnny Weissmuller in the middle. And the fellow next to him is a guy named Buster Crabbe, who you guys may know as a great swimmer and also, of course, as an actor. But Duke is not able to make the team in 1932. Other people have written that he did make the team, and I think we try to debunk that in the book, as we try to debunk a few myths that have arisen around Duke. And this was one of them. But he fails to make the team, frankly. And the gentleman who does succeed, and he's finishing up here, is Buster Crabbe. And Buster is the only American male to win a gold medal. Actually, it's the Japanese swimmers are the dominant swimmers in 1932, 1936. But Buster Crabbe, by being in LA and winning and being who he is, he's a great looking guy and very charismatic. Of course, Buster Crabbe, as we know, went on to a huge Hollywood career. And of course, so did Duke's earlier rival, which was Johnny Weissmuller. And this comes out right around the time of the 1932 Olympic Games. And of course, Johnny Weissmuller as Tarzan, it was perfect for him. He could wear a loincloth. He didn't have to say very much except grunt a little bit and play with the monkey. And it must have been a little disappointing. Duke was a very taciturn guy. He didn't talk about his emotions and disappointments, but this was certainly one of them. And he pretty much retreated to Hawaii after this. He left LA around 1930, came back for the 32 games, moved back to Hawaii. These are two of his brothers, Sergeant and Sam. And basically he spends the rest of his life, he travels quite a bit, but he spends most of the rest of his life in Hawaii, back in his homeland. And sort of tries to figure out what's next. What does a high school dropout do? And he is persuaded to run for sheriff of Honolulu. And it's sort of a patronage type job, but it's also an elected office. And he runs and wins every other year. And that becomes his job. In a sense, he follows from his father, who was the police sergeant and in law enforcement. And he holds that job from basically mid to late 30s all the way up to 1959, when, of course, Hawaii becomes the 50th state. He also has sort of a sideline, which is to say, and you see him in the back of the outrigger, Diamond Head in the distance, he's now as big a celebrity as pretty much every sports star. And so when important people come to Hawaii in the 30s, and tourism is now starting to really boom in Hawaii, of course, because transportation's a little bit easier. People have some money after the Depression. And so the rich and the famous come, and they often are steered to Duke for entertainment, to go out in an outrigger, and to just hobnob with Duke Kahanamoku. So of course there's Babe Ruth, who was en route or coming back from Japan to do a exhibition in the 30s. And Amelia Earhart, of course, before, of course, her plane crash. And if necessary, he would indulge in a little hula if the spirit moved him. And he was a great, great dancer, apparently. And one of the controversial aspects of his life that had really never been brought out before, certainly about him, outside of the sports realm, was one of the famous people who came to Hawaii in the 30s, and that's Doris Duke, who, as you see, is in the middle with Duke and his brothers. And Doris Duke, for those who don't know that name, her family is, of course, Duke University. It was a tobacco fortune, and her parents died when she was very young. She was the richest little girl in the world, and she came to Hawaii for a honeymoon and loved Hawaii, loved the Kahanamoku brothers, and that's Sam Kahanamoku and Doris Duke, and again, she's a married woman. And so there have been reports of, did she have an affair with Sam? Did she have an affair with Duke? She had a child who was born who lived for a couple days and then passed away, and nobody's sure who the father was, and there's been rumors that it was Duke or Sam. So that was a bit of a mystery. In this time, Duke marries in 1940 to Nadine Alexander, or Nadine Alexander as she would pronounce it, 1940. And she was a Haole woman, a white woman from the mainland. She was a ballroom dancer instructor. And by all accounts, quite a bit of an age difference, by all accounts very different, but enjoyed a long marriage. And Duke was married to her for the rest of his life. And so in a sense, he's now settled. We're talking 1940. He's ensconced as the sheriff of Honolulu. He's married. And of course, all that gets disrupted by Pearl Harbor in 1941. Duke, is part of the law enforcement, but not a big part of the war effort. But it does, of course, change, again, the direction of Hawaii and where it's going. Duke remains, during this time, still sort of a celebrity. I mean, he comes to the mainland, to Santa Cruz, to surf, to bring a team. This is Southern California. And this was taken by a famous early surf photographer, Doc Ball. And this is Duke in Orange County, like 1949. And it's interesting because he gets embraced by the surf community. A little bit more, the Olympic committee's there, but the Olympics are every 4 years. The surfing's going sort of nuts, and surfing's really starting to grow in the post-war America, and especially on the mainland. Southern California starting to rival Hawaii as the epicenter of surfing. And Duke is seen as sort of the godfather of surfing. He's the connection between ancient surf riding and the modern era. And they're starting to move away from wood boards. They're going to, the more modern boards. And Duke has a surf team. He gets backed by a promoter. And they have a Duke Kahanamoku Invitational. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but this is North Shore. I mean, because now you can, even though those boards are pretty big by today's standards, they are a lot more maneuverable. They've got fins, and people have been starting to surf the North Shore starting from the late 50s. So that becomes the epicenter of surfing in Hawaii, the North Shore. And these are, 3 of those gentlemen are still alive today. I interviewed, all 3 of them for the book. And they're all in the Surfing Hall of Fame. He opened up his club, the Duke Kahanamoku's club. His big act, who he helped make a huge star, was, of course, Don Ho. So Don Ho broke big there. And of course, the restaurants today, Duke's, like in Malibu and also in Hawaii and in Orange County, they're not connected with that Duke Kahanamoku's, but it was sort of that initial idea. And in a sense, Duke was one of the first athletes to be branded, what we would call branded today. And it was about creating surfboards and a club and that sort of thing. He was still trotted out when need be, when President John F. Kennedy came. I tried really hard to make a connection with Duke and President Obama because, of course, President Obama was born in '61 in Hawaii, and I tried. I'm not sure how successful I was, but I'm hoping he reads the book and lets me know if there's any anecdotes for the paperback edition. And he's honored. I mean, now he's, of course, an older man. He's in his late 70s. He's there at the Swimming Hall of Fame, Johnny Weissmuller, Buster Crabbe. But like I said, he's really more connected with the surf community for various reasons, in part by the promotion and in part because surfing gets really, super sexy in the 60s. You've got Gidget, you've got the Beach Boys, Dick Dale, that sort of thing. Duke's health starts failing, of course, in the late 60s. He has some illnesses and ailments. He's looking a little bit old there. He dies in 1968, which was the same year people have pointed out as Hawaii Five-0. The original Hawaii Five-0 comes on the air. So there's your lifespan, Queen Liliuokalani to Hawaii Five-0 and Bookham Dano. And his funeral was one of the biggest Beach Boy funerals on the beaches of Waikiki. And Nadine, his widow, is in the white, and that's on the beach, and they take out his ashes into the ocean and sprinkle him, sort of the traditional Beach Boy funeral. So really his legacy, I'll wrap this up, and again, welcome your questions afterwards. His legacy, of course, is extensive. I mean, they rallied to do a postage stamp. He's the godfather of surfing, so much so that in 1999, I mean, they called him the surfer of the century. He hadn't surfed in 50 years. That's his legacy. He's the touchstone to the ancient days of Hawaii, to those traditions, to the modern era. And of course to today, turning 125 this summer. And as you can see, even Google just said surfboard, surfboard, surfboard. And as well it should, because that's what we'll know. But I mentioned the branding. I think that was an important element. And I do also want to point out, as I've touched on during this talk, his role as a racial pioneer. And I think that was been ignored. People talk about Jesse Owens and Joe Louis and those Jack Johnson and all well and good heroes and pioneers. And I think sometimes Duke has been lost in that sort of shuffle. And I think, in a sense, I hope this book brings that out. So thank you for your attention, and thanks for coming, and would love to welcome your questions.
So I've been to the Outrigger Canoe Club, and there's a plaque on the wall, and it says that he was a member, so I guess maybe later they made him a member?
Correct.
Or?
Correct. They sort of were shamed into it. But after his Olympic heroics, and after he was supported, and his sort of nickname was the Ambassador of Aloha, and there's still a big statue of Duke on the beach in Waikiki. Once that happened, once they realized, the business interests realized that he was an asset to Hawaii and to promoting Hawaii, they brought him into the fold. And it's controversial to this day, a little bit, because when his widow passed away some years after his death, the legacy of his name and likeness went to a nonprofit, but controlled by the Outrigger. And a lot of Hawaiians were upset about that, because in a sense it was usurping the name, the Kahanamoku name, under the Outrigger, which had turned him away. But yes, he was a member, starting from the late teens, and then for the rest of his life. And he made that one of his locales.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
You alluded to some controversy about his first Olympics. Can you say something else about that?
Sure. In 1912 in Stockholm, so the 100 meters, I guess there were 3 Americans competing for, to make it to the finals. And they came out after winning the quarterfinals, and they were told by their coaches, oh, the semifinals are the next day. So they all retreated to the ship. That was the athletes' village back then. For the American team, the athletes slept on the ship. They didn't realize, or they got the wrong information. And the semis were that night. And the 3 Americans missed it. They missed the race. Technically, they should have been disqualified. And there were several countries, athletes who said, hey, they're done. Apparently, some of the Australian contingent athletes said, hey, that's unfair. This is 1912. Hey, that's unfair. That's not good sportsmanship. You can't penalize them for just missing a start time. So the swimming powers that be met and came up with a compromise, which was they got another heat to run, to race, and Duke was able to win and qualify for the finals. And then in the finals, he wins. But this was over several days, and so when you read the newspapers from back then, the headlines are, Kahanamoku misses race or disqualified. And so it took days before they could figure this out in Hawaii. And remember, back then, it's telegraph and so forth, communication-wise. It's not quite the Google aspect of things. So there was a lot of controversy, and that gentleman who spearheaded the Australian contingent saying, hey, let Duke race, was a guy named Cedric Healy, and Duke beat him. Cedric Healy got the silver medal. So his good sportsmanship maybe cost him a gold. And unfortunately, just on a postscript, Cedric Healy was killed at Gallipoli in 1915, or 1916. So, but yeah, that was the controversy.